All right, so last time we were in the she shed, I declared that it was done. And it looks wonderful, but what's wrong, honey?
Well, now I need a library.
Have you ever wondered if you married the wrong person? Yeah, not me. It all started years ago when shopping for an engagement ring, and she put back the $5,000 ring that the salesperson tried to get us to buy and pick something closer to $1,000. We also only paid $300 for our wedding. I say all that to say, instead of using expensive $80 or $90 a sheet plywood, she said it was okay for me to use this $50 a sheet pine plywood. This bookshelf took 11 sheets of plywood, and I had to cut a lot of dados for the shelves. I wanted to make sure that they were all the same distance apart, and so I created this jig that I could cut the dado and then slide the jig down into that dado that I just cut and run the router along the outside of it, and that ensured that each one of them was the exact same distance. The jig was designed in a way that I could butt it up with the end of the plywood, cut the first dado, then take the jig, flip it over, and it was the exact distance to cut a rabbit on the top of the bookshelf. Did I mention this took 11 sheets of plywood? I started by ripping all 11 sheets of plywood in half to make them easier to manage. And then the 6 sheets of plywood that are going to be used for the uprights, I cut the dados in. Then I set the table saw fence to the depth that I wanted the bookshelf to be and cut my slices out of each one of those sheets. Then without moving the table saw fence, I cut all of the sheets that didn't have dados cut in them to be used as the horizontal shelf pieces. At the miter saw, setting the stop block, I cut all of those pieces without dados down so that they would be the exact distance for the shelves. Once I had all the pieces cut, I started assembling, well, the bookshelves as individual bookshelves. Each one of these is 3 foot wide, and there's going to be 6 for a total of 18 feet wide. Does anyone else dislike a micromanaging supervisor? Nah, I'm just kidding. She was actually filming me bringing in each of the individual bookshelves for her own channel. Once I had all 6 individual bookshelves in place, I clamped 2 together at a time, drilled pilot holes, and added some screws. I'm actually using pocket hole screws here because they have a built-on washer and don't sink down into the wood as bad as regular screws. Just as I was finishing up connecting the individual pieces into sections of 2, Mom and Pop showed up, and he immediately told me I was doing it the wrong way. So I let him, quote unquote, show me how to connect them the right way. I appreciated the help. To figure out the angled pieces, I found it best just to take measurements from each end and just draw it directly on my work table. Then, using the measurements directly from my work table, I could cut out the sides, add the dados or rabbets where needed, and then assemble the pieces. Just like the individual bookshelves below them, there's going to be 6, and each one is a little bit different. I lined up the top section with the bottom section and then screwed directly through the bottom of the top section into the top of the bottom section. And by doing so, I created a double thickness of plywood at the 8-foot mark, or the top of the bottom section. I need that double thickness for a future portion of this build. I've yet to find a wood supplier that sells 18 feet lengths of lumber. So in the meantime, I cut out strips of this maple to use as the face frame. These boards are somewhere around 10 foot long, so I'll have to make a joint in the middle. But before cutting them to the length that I needed, I added a profile, I can't even remember what kind of bit this is, to give it some three-dimensional effect. Instead of just butting those two pieces together in the middle, I cut 45-degree angles to use as a scarf joint. It's a little less noticeable than just a regular butt joint. I added a profile on just the top of the baseboard piece, and then because some of the bottom shelves had a little bit of sag, I put some wooden shims between the concrete and the shelf. Once I had it all straight across, I went ahead and added glue and brad nails to the baseboard trim. I didn't film it, but I did come back and add some matching colored wood filler to all of these 18-gauge brad nail holes. For the face frame trim at the 8-foot mark, I added a profile on the top and bottom of it, and then just glued it in place and held it with bandy clamps until it dried. Because I don't want to spend a fortune on additional pieces of pipe for this rolling library ladder kit that I picked up on Amazon, I used some 3/4 inch pipe that I pulled out of a dumpster on a job site years ago. I've been hanging on to it for a while, and this was the perfect place to use it. But even the longest piece of it that I had was 10 foot long, and this shelf is 18 feet wide. I had to come up with a way to join two pieces together. And this 1/2 inch nipple ground down to fit inside of that 3/4 pipe worked out perfectly. The joint doesn't necessarily need to be strong. It just needs to keep the two sections of pipe aligned so that the wheels can roll over it. I marked it at 2-foot increments to drill holes to add screws. I want all of my screw holes to be in a straight line, and in order to keep the pipe from spinning as I drilled it, I cut out this triangle section on a scrap piece of plywood and then duplicated it, stuck the pipe in between the two pieces and screwed them together, like this. Once that was done, I could use a spring-loaded punch to mark the locations of all of my screw holes. Using a little cutting oil, I started with a small bit and drilled all the way through the pipe. Then on one side, I used a unibit or step bit to drill a slightly larger hole. I did try a regular drill bit, but this is what happened. The holes cut with the step bit had to be big enough to fit the outside diameter of this 1/4 inch copper pipe that I'm using as standoffs. The pipe has to stick out a little bit from the face frame in order for the wheels to roll along it. I cleaned all the residual oil off with some acetone and then took it outside and added a coat of black spray paint. It was a challenge getting this entire length of pipe up in place so that I could mark for the hole locations. But by using a couple of F-style clamps, I did get those holes marked, drilled the pilot, and then I could add those standoffs and use 4-inch screws through the pipe, through the standoff, through the face frame, and into the 2 sheets of plywood behind it. At this point, I realized I'd made a mistake. Because I built these as individual bookshelves and connected them, the vertical pieces in the middle were double thickness, but the ones on the end were only single thickness. To keep it uniform for my vertical face frame trim, I cut these short pieces of plywood and then glued and nailed them to the inside of the ends of the bookshelf. I typically purchase rough cut lumber over factory surfaced and finished for a couple of reasons. One, it's typically much cheaper, and two, I enjoy the process of milling my own lumber. But when you need as much as I do for this project, it takes quite a bit of time. After marathon milling, sanding, and routing profiles, I decided it would be much easier just to use my old miter box and save me a trip back and forth from my shop to her shop. I also thought it wise to purchase a 23 gauge pin nailer because I can glue these strips in place, add some 23 gauge pin nails, and there's no hole to come back and have to use wood filler in. Back at the power tools, I cut about 1 million strips of maple to use as plywood edge banding, added a tiny chamfer on the top and the bottom, and then took them over to her shop, glued them, and pin nailed them into place. I had a difficult time finding a piece of maple long enough for the library ladder, but I did come up with this piece of 5/4. And using that same jig that I used for the bookshelves, I just cut it in half so it would be shorter. I used it to cut in dados for the ladder rungs. I took my time and was extremely careful because I didn't have another piece that I could use if I messed this up. While Queenie, my shop chicken, was laying an egg under my drill press, I cut 3-inch wide strips for the ladder sides. I milled down a bunch of oversized dominoes to use as the ladder rungs, and then flipped the sides of the ladder over, clamped them together, and marked locations to drill pilot holes. I started those pilot holes by using a 3/8-inch Forstner bit at the drill press. I am going to be screwing this ladder together, but I want to hide those screw heads using 3/8 dowels. I marked the locations for the screws for the lockable rolling wheels that go on the bottom of the ladder, and then drilled out those pilot holes. For assembling the ladder, I started on one side, added some glue, finished drilling the pilot hole through that 3/8 hole, and then added screws. Then I could stand it up on the finished side, repeat the process, and make sure that I got a good shot of my armpit. The next day, I glued in those 3/8 dowels into those holes to cover up the screw heads. and then came back with a flush trim saw and sawed them off. After giving everything a final sanding, I came back and added a 1/4 inch roundover to all parts of the ladder. I had to disassemble, take the wheel off of the bracket in order to get to the screw holes to screw it to the side of the ladder, but it wasn't that complicated to disassemble and reassemble it. Next, I took the finished ladder over to the she shed, clamped it to the rollers, and made sure that it would roll. I added 1 screw to each bracket before removing the clamps, and then once the clamps were out of the way, added the rest of the screws through the brackets into the ladder. Most of these ladder kit assemblies come with a stop block, but because I used my own pipe, I didn't have one. So I spray painted and added a 3/4 inch steel cap as a stop block. This will also allow me to remove the ladder in the future to service it or rebuild it if needed.
That's so much fun, I could do that all afternoon. But this project was kind of challenging, but I am happy with the way that it came out. So I built her a bookshelf. And stay tuned to find out what she thinks about it. Ta-da!
Oh, that's so awesome. Look how cute! Oh my gosh. Oh, that's amazing. Can I walk the wheels? Am I gonna die?
No, you'll just go for a ride.
Look how cool.
All right, I think she loves it. Make sure you guys like, subscribe, and comment, because I'd like to get this channel monetized so that I can afford the next project, which will probably be the Library of Congress. Thanks for watching.